The carriage door slammed shut, and Eleanor Whitfield knew there was no turning back now. She sat stiffly on the worn velvet seat, her gloved hands twisted together in her lap, as the wheels rattled over the cobblestones leading toward Ashworth House. She had never wanted to come to London. She had never wanted to meet the Duke of Ashworth. And yet here she was, summoned like a piece on a chessboard, moved without being asked. Her aunt had delivered the letter only 3 days earlier, her face pale with disbelief. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth had written personally, requesting that Eleanor be brought to town at once. There was no explanation, only an instruction, firm and unshakable, the kind that came from a woman who was used to being obeyed. Eleanor had read the letter twice, certain there had been some mistake. She was nobody. Her family held a small estate in Hampshire, more debt than land, and a name that meant nothing among the peerage. Why would a duchess, the grandmother of the most talked-about bachelor in England, want anything to do with her? The answer came slowly, delivered by her aunt in hushed, worried tones during the long journey to London. The Duke of Ashworth had rejected every young woman brought before him, not once, not twice, but again and again, for 3 full seasons. Mothers had paraded their daughters through his drawing room like prize mares at auction, each one more beautiful, more accomplished, more richly dowered than the last. He had turned every single one away. Some said he was cold, others whispered that his heart had been broken long ago and never mended. A few dared to suggest that he simply enjoyed the power of rejection, delighting in watching ambitious families crumble under his indifference. Whatever the truth, the Dowager Duchess had grown tired of waiting for her grandson to choose a bride on his own. The Ashworth line needed an heir, and patience, it seemed, had run out. Eleanor had no illusions about why she had been chosen. She was not beautiful in the fashionable sense, not accomplished at the pianoforte or fluent in French poetry. She could manage a household on almost nothing, mend a fence with her own hands if the tenant farmers needed help, and keep her family's crumbling estate from collapsing entirely, since her father's death 2 years before. She was practical, she was plain, and she suspected that was exactly why the Dowager Duchess wanted her. Not because she would please the Duke, but because she would not play his games. The carriage rolled to a stop outside a townhouse, so large it seemed to swallow the entire street. Eleanor stepped down, her plain gray traveling dress a sharp contrast to the marble steps and gilded door before her. A footman led her through a grand hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her with silent judgment. She was brought to a drawing room where the Dowager Duchess waited, seated upright in a high-backed chair, her silver hair pinned with precision, her expression unreadable. "So you are Eleanor Whitfield," the Dowager said, studying her with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Sit down, child, we have much to discuss, and very little time." Eleanor obeyed, perching on the edge of a chair that felt far too fine for her traveling clothes. "Your Grace, I confess I do not understand why I am here." "No," the Dowager said, almost amused. "I imagine you do not. Let me be direct, since I find directness saves everyone a great deal of trouble. My grandson, the Duke, requires a wife. He has rejected every suitable young woman in England, and I have decided he no longer gets to choose unsuitable ones instead. You will meet him this evening." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "Your Grace, I have no dowry to speak of, no connections that would benefit a duke, and no experience in society that would not embarrass your family." "Good," the Dowager said simply. "That is precisely why you are here." Before Eleanor could ask what that meant, the drawing room door opened, and a man entered whose presence seemed to change the temperature of the room itself. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing that fit him with severe precision. His face was handsome in a hard, unyielding way, the kind of face that had likely never needed to smile to command a room. His eyes, a cold shade of gray, swept over Eleanor with visible disinterest before turning to his grandmother with open irritation. "Grandmother, I was told there was a matter requiring my immediate attention. I see now that this was a lie." "It was not a lie," the Dowager said calmly. "This is Miss Eleanor Whitfield. She will be your wife." The Duke's jaw tightened. "I will not be dictated to in my own household. This is my household, Julian, until the day I choose to leave it," the Dowager said, her voice sharp as a blade despite her age. "And you have had 3 seasons to choose a wife on your own merit. You have failed spectacularly. I am done watching you insult every respectable family in London while our line withers for want of an heir." Julian, Duke of Ashworth, turned his gaze back to Eleanor, and she felt it like a physical weight, cold and assessing. "You will forgive me, Miss Whitfield, if I do not share my grandmother's enthusiasm for this arrangement." Eleanor rose to her feet, her cheeks burning, but her voice steady. "You need not apologize to me, Your Grace. I share no enthusiasm for it either. I did not ask to be brought here, and I certainly did not ask to be presented to a man who looks at me as though I were an inconvenience delivered to his door. Something flickered in the Duke's expression, surprise perhaps, or irritation at being spoken to so plainly. Most young women who came before him trembled, flattered, or wept. None had ever simply told him the truth. "You are correct," he said after a pause. "You are an inconvenience." "Julian," the dowager warned. "No, Your Grace," Eleanor said quickly, holding up a hand. "Let him speak. I would rather know exactly where I stand than be given false courtesy." The Duke studied her a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind his cold eyes. "Very well. Where you stand, Miss Whitfield, is nowhere. I have no intention of marrying a stranger chosen by my grandmother, regardless of how tired she has grown of my company at balls." "Then we are in agreement on one point at least," Eleanor said. "I have no intention of marrying a man who cannot manage a single civil sentence in his own drawing room." The Dowager Duchess, to Eleanor's surprise, let out a short, sharp laugh. "Well, this is progress already." The Duke did not look amused. He turned on his heel and left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, with the force of a door slamming, though no door had been touched. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart pounding, uncertain whether she had just ruined everything, or accomplished exactly what needed to be done. The Dowager rose slowly from her chair and crossed the room, studying Eleanor with an expression that had shifted from calculation to something closer to approval. "My grandson has been chased, flattered, and pursued by every ambitious mother in England," the Dowager said quietly. "He has learned to see through every kindness as a calculation, every smile as a strategy. You gave him none of that. You gave him honesty, and it startled him more than any beauty ever could." "I did not mean to be rude, Your Grace," Eleanor said, still shaken. "You were not rude. You were truthful. There is a difference, though few in this city seem to understand it anymore." The Dowager returned to her chair, folding her hands. "You will stay in London for the season, as my guest. I will not force you to marry my grandson, whatever gossip may say to the contrary, but I ask that you give him, and yourself, the chance to see what might grow between two people who refuse to lie to each other." Eleanor hesitated. Everything in her wanted to refuse, to return to Hampshire, to the quiet fields and the familiar burden of her family's debts, where at least she understood the rules of her own life. But something about the Dowager's request, and something about the flash of surprise she had seen in the Duke's eyes, made her pause. "I will stay," she said finally, "but I make no promises beyond that, Your Grace." "I would think less of you if you did," the Dowager replied. That evening, Eleanor was given a room far grander than anything she had known in Hampshire, with silk curtains and a bed large enough for 4 people. She sat by the window long after the candles had burned low, watching the lights of London flicker across the rooftops, and thought of the cold-eyed Duke who had looked at her as though she were an inconvenience, and yet had lingered in that drawing room a moment longer than he needed to before he stormed away. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she suspected, with a strange and unfamiliar flutter in her chest, that her quiet life had just come to an end, whether she wanted it to or not. Downstairs, in his private study, Julian Ashworth poured himself a glass of brandy he did not drink. He stood by the window, staring out at the darkened garden, replaying the conversation in the drawing room again and again. No woman had ever spoken to him like that. No woman had ever dared. He told himself it meant nothing, that she was simply another pawn in his grandmother's endless campaign to see him married, no different from the dozens who had come before. But he could not stop hearing her voice, steady and unafraid, telling him exactly what she thought of him. And against every instinct he possessed, he found himself wondering what Eleanor Whitfield would say to him next. Morning came to Ashworth House with a bustle Eleanor had never experienced in Hampshire. Maids moved through the halls with trays of chocolate and fresh linens. Footmen carried messages between floors, and somewhere below, a cook shouted orders through the kitchen with the urgency of a general commanding troops. Eleanor dressed quickly in her plainest gown, unwilling to borrow anything finer from the wardrobe the housekeeper had offered her the night before. She was a guest here, not a member of the family, and she intended to remember that distinction no matter what the Dowager Duchess hoped for. She found the Dowager already seated at breakfast, a newspaper folded beside her plate, her expression composed as always. "Good morning, Eleanor. I trust you slept well." "Well enough, Your Grace," Eleanor said, taking the seat offered to her, "though I confess I am still uncertain why I am here." "You are here because my grandson needs someone who will not flatter him into submission," the Dowager said, buttering a piece of toast with unhurried precision. "You accomplished more in 5 minutes yesterday than half of London's mothers managed in 3 seasons." I insulted him. You were honest with him. In his experience, the two have become nearly identical, which tells you a great deal about the company he has kept. The dowager set down her knife. He will join us shortly. Try not to insult him again before he has finished his coffee. He is unbearable enough as it is. True to her word, the Duke arrived a few minutes later, dressed for riding, his expression carefully blank as he took his seat at the head of the table. He offered Eleanor a curt nod, nothing more, and turned his attention to the letters stacked beside his plate. The silence stretched uncomfortably until the dowager, with the air of a woman accustomed to steering conversations wherever she pleased, spoke again. Julian, I have arranged for you to show Eleanor the gardens this morning. She has expressed an interest in the roses. Eleanor had expressed no such thing, but she held her tongue, recognizing the dowager's maneuvering for exactly what it was. Julian looked up, clearly displeased. I have business at the estate office this morning. Your business can wait an hour, the dowager said pleasantly, in a tone that made clear it was not a request. And so, 20 minutes later, Eleanor found herself walking beside the Duke of Ashworth, through a garden far grander than any she had tended in Hampshire, the silence between them thick enough to touch. She studied the neat rows of roses, red and white, trimmed with obsessive precision, and thought of the wild, overgrown garden behind her family's house. Roses that grew however they pleased because no one had the time or money to discipline them. You need not pretend interest in flowers you clearly do not care for, Julian said finally, breaking the silence. I care for flowers a great deal, Your Grace, Eleanor said. I simply prefer ones that are allowed to grow as they wish, rather than forced into rows. He glanced at her, something unreadable in his gray eyes. An odd philosophy for a garden, perhaps, but it has always struck me that the most beautiful things rarely grow well when someone insists on controlling every inch of them. They walked in silence a while longer, before Julian spoke again, his voice quieter this time. My grandmother tells me you manage your family's estate yourself, that your father left considerable debts, and that you have kept the household running since his death. Eleanor's spine stiffened. Your grandmother speaks a great deal about matters that are not hers to share. She means no unkindness by it. I think she wanted me to understand why you are unlike every other young woman who has been paraded before me. He paused near a stone bench, his hands clasped behind his back. Most of them arrive with a list of accomplishments memorized for my benefit. Piano, French, watercolors. You arrive with calluses on your hands, and no interest in impressing me at all. Eleanor glanced down at her gloved hands, self-conscious for the first time since arriving in London. Forgive me if that displeases you. It does not displease me, Julian said, and something in his tone had shifted, softer than before, though still guarded. It simply confuses me. I have spent 3 seasons assuming every woman who smiled at me wanted my title and nothing else. I do not know what to do with one who does not seem to want it at all. I do not want your title, Eleanor said honestly. I did not ask to come here, Your Grace, and I certainly did not come seeking a duke. Your grandmother summoned me, and I obeyed, because refusing a duchess is not something easily done when one's family depends on staying in the good graces of anyone with influence. Julian's expression darkened slightly. So you are here out of obligation. I am here because I had little choice, but I did not lie to you yesterday, and I will not lie to you now. I find you difficult, Your Grace, cold even, but I do not find you dishonest, and in my experience, that is a rarer quality than kindness. He studied her for a long moment, and for the first time since she had met him, something like the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. You are the strangest woman I have ever met, Miss Whitfield. I will take that as a compliment, Your Grace, since I suspect you rarely offer them. You would be correct. Their walk was interrupted by the arrival of a footman, who informed the Duke that a visitor had arrived and was waiting in the drawing room. Julian's expression shifted instantly, the brief warmth of their conversation replaced by something guarded and wary. Lady Camden, he muttered, more to himself than to Eleanor. A friend of yours? Eleanor asked. An acquaintance who believes herself entitled to more than friendship, Julian said dryly. You will forgive me, Miss Whitfield. Duty calls, unfortunately. He left her standing among the roses, and Eleanor watched him go, curious despite herself about the woman who had caused such a visible change in his demeanor. She did not have to wait long to understand. Lady Camilla Camden was, by any measure, a striking woman, golden-haired, elegantly dressed in the height of fashion, with the kind of practiced charm that came from years of navigating society's most demanding drawing rooms. Eleanor caught only a glimpse of her through the drawing-room window as she passed by on her way back into the house. but it was enough to see the way Lady Camden's eyes lit up at the sight of the Duke, and the way her smile did not quite reach those same eyes when she noticed Eleanor's plain gray dress passing outside. Later that afternoon, as Eleanor sat in the small library reading one of the few books she recognized among the Ashworth collection, the housekeeper, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Pemberton, brought her a tray of tea and lingered a moment longer than necessary. "You mustn't mind Lady Camden, miss," Mrs. Pemberton said quietly, glancing toward the door. "She has set her sights on His Grace for 2 years now, ever since her husband passed. The whole staff knows it, though His Grace has never shown her more than polite tolerance." "I have no reason to mind her at all," Eleanor said, though she found herself curious despite her words. "I am merely a guest here, Mrs. Pemberton." "Of course, miss," Mrs. Pemberton said, though her knowing smile suggested she believed otherwise. That evening, at a small family dinner attended only by the Dowager, the Duke, and Eleanor, Lady Camden's name arose again when the Dowager mentioned, almost carelessly, that she had heard the lady was hosting a grand ball at the end of the week, one to which the entire Ashworth household had been invited. "I have no interest in attending," Julian said flatly. "You will attend," the Dowager said, "because refusing would create precisely the kind of gossip you claim to despise. And you will bring Eleanor." Eleanor nearly choked on her wine. "Your Grace, I have no ball gown, no experience with London society, and no desire to be paraded in front of a room full of strangers, who will wonder why a duke's grandmother has brought a stranger to a ball." "Then it is fortunate," the Dowager said calmly, "that I have already arranged for a seamstress to visit you tomorrow morning." Julian said nothing, but Eleanor noticed the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes flicked toward her with something that might have been concern, or perhaps simple curiosity about how she would fare in a room full of people who had spent their entire lives learning the very games she had never been taught to play. That night, alone in her room, Eleanor stared at her reflection in the mirror, wondering what she had gotten herself into. She had come to London expecting to endure a brief, awkward introduction, before being sent home with her dignity intact and her family's situation unchanged. Instead, she found herself entangled in a household full of secrets, rivalries, and a duke whose cold exterior seemed to crack, just slightly, whenever she refused to play by the rules everyone else in London seemed to follow. She did not know if that was a good thing or a terrible one, but she suspected, as she blew out her candle and settled into the unfamiliar softness of her bed, that the ball at the end of the week would answer that question far sooner than she was ready for. The seamstress arrived promptly at 9 the next morning, a brisk woman named Mrs. Ellery who took one look at Eleanor and declared, with the confidence of someone who had dressed countesses and duchesses alike, that green silk would suit her far better than the pale pastels currently fashionable among London's debutantes. Eleanor stood still for hours as pins were placed and fabric draped, feeling increasingly like a doll being assembled for someone else's amusement rather than a woman preparing for an evening of her own choosing. "You have good posture," Mrs. Ellery remarked, tugging at a seam. "Most young ladies slouch from nerves. You stand as though you have carried real weight before." "I have carried grain sacks and mended fences, Mrs. Ellery," Eleanor said. "I suppose that leaves little room for slouching." The seamstress laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "Well, it shows. His Grace's household could use a bit of honest labor in its blood, if you ask me, though nobody ever does." By the time the fitting ended, Eleanor's arms ached, and her patience had worn thin, but she found herself oddly grateful for the distraction. Thinking about fabric and hemlines was far easier than thinking about the ball ahead, or about Lady Camden's cold smile, or about the strange, unsettling way Julian had looked at her among the roses the day before. She encountered him again that afternoon in the estate office, where she had wandered by accident while searching for the library, and instead found him bent over a ledger, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, a frown of concentration on his face that made him look, for a moment, less like a duke, and more like an ordinary man wrestling with ordinary numbers. "Forgive me," Eleanor said, moving to leave. "I did not mean to intrude." "You are not intruding," Julian said, setting down his pen, "unless you have come to insult me again, in which case I would ask for a moment to prepare myself." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "No insults today, Your Grace. I promise nothing about tomorrow." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and after a moment's hesitation, she sat. The office was simple compared to the rest of the house, plain wooden shelves lined with ledgers and correspondence, a worn rug beneath a heavy desk, none of the gilded excess she had seen elsewhere in Ashworth House. "This is not what I expected," she admitted, glancing around. "I imagined a duke's study would be far grander." "This is where the real work happens," Julian said. "The grand rooms are for show. This room is where I ensure 5,000 acres and several hundred tenant families do not fall into ruin because of poor decisions made a generation before me. Eleanor's curiosity sharpened. Poor decisions? Julian hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might change the subject entirely, retreat back into the cold formality that had defined their first meeting. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "My father was not a careful man," he said finally. "He spent freely, invested poorly, and left this estate in far worse condition than his own father had left it to him. When he died, I inherited not only his title, but every mistake attached to it. It has taken me nearly 10 years to restore what he nearly destroyed in 20. "I am sorry," Eleanor said quietly. "That is a heavy inheritance. It is why I have little patience for young women who arrive believing marriage to a duke means an endless supply of jewels and carriages," Julian said, his voice hardening slightly. "The truth is far less glamorous. It means responsibility, sacrifice, choices made for the estate rather than for oneself. That sounds remarkably similar to managing a small country estate on the edge of ruin," Eleanor said. "Perhaps the scale is different, Your Grace, but the burden is not so unfamiliar to me as you might think." Something shifted in Julian's expression, a flicker of genuine surprise, followed by something warmer, something almost like respect. "No," he said slowly. "I suppose it is not." They talked longer than either of them intended, Julian explaining the challenges of managing tenant farms and unpredictable harvests, Eleanor sharing her own struggles keeping her family's small estate afloat since her father's death, the debts he had left behind, the neighbors who had circled like vultures hoping to buy the land out from under her family at half its worth. For the first time since arriving in London, Eleanor felt herself relax, speaking not as a guest performing gratitude, nor as a stranger being evaluated for marriage, but simply as herself. It was Julian who noticed the hour first, glancing at the clock on the mantel with visible surprise. "I had no idea it had grown so late. I have kept you far longer than I intended." "I did not mind," Eleanor said, and realized, with some surprise of her own, that she meant it. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a footman bearing a calling card, and Julian's expression shifted instantly back to the guarded coolness Eleanor had come to recognize as his default. "Lady Camden again," he said, reading the card with visible irritation. "She seems determined to occupy every free hour of my week." "Perhaps she simply enjoys your company," Eleanor said, though something uncomfortable twisted in her chest at the thought. "Lady Camden enjoys the idea of becoming a duchess," Julian said flatly. "My company is merely the obstacle standing between her and that ambition." He excused himself to attend to his visitor, leaving Eleanor alone in the study, staring at the ledgers scattered across his desk, wondering why the mention of Lady Camden had left her feeling unsettled in a way she did not fully understand. That evening, Eleanor wrote a letter home to her aunt, describing the household in careful, measured terms, omitting the strange flutter she had begun to feel whenever the Duke's guarded expression cracked, even briefly, into something more honest. She had not come to London to fall into anything as foolish as affection for a man who had made his disinterest in marriage abundantly clear. And yet, sealing the letter and setting it aside, she found herself thinking not of Hampshire, nor of her family's debts, but of the quiet, unexpected warmth in Julian's voice when he had spoken of the estate he had spent 10 years rebuilding. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Hampshire that shattered whatever fragile peace Eleanor had begun to find in London. Her aunt's handwriting, usually steady and composed, was hurried and anxious, informing Eleanor that a merchant to whom her late father owed a considerable debt had grown impatient and threatened to seize what remained of the family's land if payment was not received within the month. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling, the familiar weight of her family's precarious situation crashing back over her with brutal force. She had almost allowed herself to forget, these past few days, why she had truly come to London in the first place. Not for balls or gardens or unexpected conversations in a duke's study, but because her family's survival depended on the goodwill of people far more powerful than herself. She found the Dowager Duchess in the drawing room that afternoon, and, swallowing her pride, explained the situation as plainly as she could manage. The Dowager listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, until Eleanor finished. "How much is owed?" the Dowager asked simply. Eleanor named the sum, her cheeks burning with humiliation. "I do not ask for charity, Your Grace. I only wished you to understand why I may need to return home sooner than expected, should the situation worsen." "You will do no such thing," the Dowager said firmly. "Leave the matter with me. Your Grace, I could not possibly accept." I have not offered you anything yet, child, so save your protests, the dowager interrupted, though not unkindly. I merely intend to ensure my guest is not distracted by matters that can be resolved with far less difficulty than you imagine. Eleanor left the drawing room uncertain whether she felt relieved or ashamed, uncomfortable with the idea of the Ashworth family's wealth being used to solve problems that were entirely her own. She did not yet know that Julian had overheard the entire conversation from the adjoining hallway, nor that he stood there long after she had gone, turning over in his mind the quiet dignity with which she had refused charity even while drowning in debt, a stark and uncomfortable contrast to every fortune-seeking woman who had ever crossed his threshold hoping for exactly the kind of rescue Eleanor had just declined. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor wandered down to the darkened library, hoping a book might quiet her restless mind. She found Julian already there, a single candle burning on the table beside him, a glass of untouched brandy at his elbow. "You should be asleep," he said, though he made no move to leave. "So should you," she replied, taking a seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. They sat in silence for a long moment before Julian spoke again, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "I heard what you told my grandmother today." Eleanor stiffened. "Then you know I am rather more of a burden than a guest. I know that you refused help you desperately needed, because you did not wish to be seen as taking advantage of my family's generosity," Julian said. "I have known women who would have wept and pleaded for far less desperate circumstances than yours, hoping to secure my sympathy and my fortune in a single conversation. You did the opposite." "I do not want your pity, your grace, or your family's charity," Eleanor said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I have managed on my own for 2 years. I will continue to manage." "I am not offering pity," Julian said, leaning forward slightly, the candlelight flickering across the hard lines of his face. "I am offering respect, which I have found myself giving to very few people since my father died and left me this title." Eleanor's breath caught, uncertain how to respond to the sudden shift in his tone, the unfamiliar warmth in eyes that had been so cold and guarded when they first met. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them thick with something neither was quite ready to name. "I should return to my room," Eleanor said finally, rising quickly. "Eleanor," Julian said, and she paused, startled by the use of her given name for the first time since her arrival. "Whatever else happens between us, know that I do not see you the way I saw the others. I do not know yet what that means, but I did not wish you to leave this room without knowing it." She left without answering, her heart pounding as she climbed the stairs to her room, uncertain whether the flutter in her chest was fear or something far more dangerous, something she had promised herself, upon arriving in London, that she would never allow herself to feel for a man so far above her own modest station in life. News traveled fast in London, faster than Eleanor could have imagined, and within 2 days of the debt being quietly settled by the Ashworth family, whispers began circulating through the drawing rooms and ballrooms of the city that the Dowager Duchess had paid off a stranger's debts to keep her in the house as a potential bride for the Duke. Eleanor learned of the gossip not from the Dowager, nor from Julian, but from Lady Camden herself, who arrived at Ashworth House unannounced on a bright, cold afternoon, her smile as sharp as a blade beneath its polished courtesy. "Miss Whitfield," Lady Camden said, sweeping into the drawing room where Eleanor sat alone with her needlework. "How fortunate you are. I hear the Dowager has taken quite the interest in your family's finances." Eleanor set down her needlework carefully, refusing to let the woman see how the words had struck her. "The Dowager Duchess has been very generous, Lady Camden. I am grateful for her kindness." "Generous," Lady Camden repeated, settling into a chair without invitation. "That is one word for it. Others might call it desperate. A duke's grandmother, so eager to see him married that she pays off the debts of a penniless country girl just to keep her under his roof. One wonders what she fears more, that he will never marry, or that he will marry someone with far less to recommend her than a title requires." "I did not ask for the debts to be paid," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level despite the anger simmering beneath her composure. "And I did not ask to be brought here at all, Lady Camden, though I suspect you already know that." "Oh, I know a great deal, Miss Whitfield," Lady Camden said, her smile widening. "I know that your father died leaving nothing but debt and disgrace behind him. I know your family's estate has been on the verge of collapse for years, saved only by your own labor and the mercy of neighbors who pity rather than respect you. Tell me, does the Duke know the full extent of what he would be inheriting, should this ridiculous arrangement somehow reach its intended conclusion?" Eleanor rose to her feet, her hands trembling with barely contained fury. "The Duke knows precisely who I am, Lady Camden, which is more than I can say for you, since it seems you know nothing beyond gossip and speculation." I know enough, Lady Camden said, rising as well, her expression hardening beneath its polished veneer. I know that a man like Julian Ashworth was not raised to marry a woman who mends her own fences and negotiates with debt collectors. I know that the Ton will never accept you, no matter how many gowns the Dowager buys you, or how many debts she quietly settles on your behalf. And I know that when this foolish experiment collapses, as it surely will, I will still be here, waiting, exactly as I have been for 2 years. She swept from the room without another word, leaving Eleanor standing alone, shaking with a mixture of humiliation and anger she had not felt since the darkest days following her father's death. She sank back into her chair, staring blankly at the abandoned needlework in her lap, wondering, not for the first time, whether Lady Camden was right, whether she truly belonged in a world of silk gowns and ancient titles, or whether she had simply been a convenient distraction for a bored duchess and her stubborn grandson. That evening, Eleanor found it impossible to eat, pushing food around her plate while Julian and the Dowager discussed matters of little consequence, unaware of the confrontation that had taken place hours earlier. It was only when Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, mentioned in passing that Lady Camden had paid a visit that afternoon that the Dowager's sharp eyes turned toward Eleanor with sudden concern. "What did she say to you?" the Dowager asked quietly, once dinner had ended, and Julian had been called away to attend to estate correspondence. Eleanor hesitated, reluctant to repeat the cruel words that had cut so deeply, but the Dowager's steady gaze left little room for evasion. She recounted the conversation as calmly as she could manage, watching the Dowager's expression harden with each passing sentence. "That woman has always possessed more ambition than grace," the Dowager said when Eleanor finished, her voice cold with barely restrained anger. "You must not let her words take root, Eleanor. She says these things because she is frightened, and frightened people are often cruelest to those who threaten what they believe they are owed." "Perhaps she is right, though," Eleanor said quietly, voicing the doubt that had gnawed at her since the confrontation. "Perhaps I do not belong here, Your Grace. Perhaps this entire arrangement was a mistake from the beginning." "Nonsense," the Dowager said sharply. "You belong here precisely because you refuse to be the kind of woman society expects a duchess to be. That is not a weakness, Eleanor. It is the very quality my grandson has been searching for, whether he admits it to himself or not." Despite the Dowager's reassurance, Eleanor could not shake the unease that settled over her in the days that followed, made worse by the growing knowledge that the grand ball hosted by Lady Camden herself now loomed only 3 days away, an event she would have to attend, dressed in silk she had not earned, standing beside a duke whose affections remained as uncertain as her own place in his household. She threw herself into preparation instead, determined not to give Lady Camden the satisfaction of watching her crumble. Mrs. Ellery returned for final fittings, and Eleanor stood patiently through hours of adjustments, watching in the mirror as the plain country girl who had arrived in London weeks earlier slowly transformed into someone she barely recognized, draped in deep emerald silk that caught the light with every movement. It was during one such fitting that Julian appeared unexpectedly in the doorway, having apparently come searching for his grandmother and finding Eleanor instead, standing before the mirror in her half-finished gown. He stopped abruptly, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them charged with something neither seemed willing to name. "Forgive me," he said finally, though he made no move to leave. "I did not mean to intrude." "You are not intruding, Your Grace," Eleanor said, feeling suddenly self-conscious beneath his steady gaze, "though I confess this is not how I imagined being seen by you." "You look," Julian began, then paused, seeming to search for words that did not come easily to him. "You look nothing like the woman who arrived at my door 3 weeks ago, insulting me within the first 5 minutes of our acquaintance. Is that a compliment, Your Grace, or an accusation?" "Both, perhaps," Julian said, and something in his expression softened, the guarded coldness she had grown accustomed to giving way, if only briefly, to something warmer, something almost vulnerable. "I heard about Lady Camden's visit." Eleanor's cheeks colored. "It was nothing I could not manage on my own." "That does not mean you should have to," Julian said, his voice low and firm. "Whatever she said to you, know that it does not reflect the truth of who you are, nor how I have come to see you these past weeks." Eleanor's heart pounded at the unexpected sincerity in his words, but before she could respond, Mrs. Ellery cleared her throat pointedly, reminding them both of her presence, and the moment shattered as quickly as it had formed. Julian excused himself with visible reluctance, leaving Eleanor standing before the mirror once more, her reflection blurred by the sudden rush of emotion she had not expected, and was not entirely certain she welcomed. 2 nights before the ball, the Dowager summoned Eleanor to her private sitting room, a space Eleanor had not yet been invited into, decorated with portraits and mementos that spoke of a life lived long before Eleanor's own had begun. The dowager sat by the fire, a small wooden box resting on the table beside her, her expression uncharacteristically soft as Eleanor entered. "Sit, child," the dowager said. "There is something you should know before you attend that ball, something I have kept close for many years, but which I believe you deserve to understand now." Eleanor sat, watching curiously as the dowager opened the small box, revealing a faded letter and a simple silver locket nestled within. "This belonged to Julian's mother," the dowager said quietly. "My daughter-in-law, a woman far too good for the family she married into, though I did not always believe that while she was alive. She died when Julian was only 12 years old, and I have always believed that her loss is the reason he has spent his adult life building walls no woman has managed to breach, until now. Your Grace, I do not understand what this has to do with me. Julian's mother came from a family with little wealth and less standing among the ton," the dowager continued, ignoring Eleanor's confusion. "She was chosen not for connections or fortune, but because Julian's grandfather, my late husband, recognized in her a strength and honesty that no amount of money could purchase. I opposed the match at the time, foolishly, believing rank mattered more than character. I have spent 30 years regretting that opposition, watching how her quiet strength shaped Julian into the man he became, even after her death took that steadiness from him too soon." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "You are telling me this because you see her in me." "I am telling you this because I owe her family a debt I have never properly repaid," the dowager said, her voice softening further. "Your grandmother, Eleanor, was her closest friend, before circumstances and distance separated them. When I learned of your family's situation, I did not choose you at random. I chose you because I believed, given the chance, you might carry forward the very qualities I once dismissed as insignificant, and which I have come to understand were the only things that ever truly mattered." Eleanor sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation settling over her slowly. She had believed her presence in London to be little more than a stubborn old woman's scheme to force her grandson into marriage. She had not imagined it might be rooted in something far older, far deeper, a debt of kindness the dowager had carried quietly for 3 decades. "Does Julian know any of this?" Eleanor asked finally. "No," the dowager said, "and I would ask that you allow me to tell him myself, when the time is right. For now, I only wished you to understand that whatever Lady Camden or anyone else in this city may say about your worth, you belong in this family far more than mere chance would suggest." Eleanor left the dowager's sitting room that night with her mind spinning, the confrontation with Lady Camden suddenly feeling small and insignificant against the larger truth she had just learned. She did not know what the ball would bring, nor how Julian truly felt beneath the careful walls he still maintained. But she knew, walking back to her room beneath the flickering candlelight, that she was no longer simply a stranger thrust into a world she did not understand. She was, in some quiet and unexpected way, exactly where she was meant to be. The Camden ballroom blazed with candlelight when Eleanor arrived on Julian's arm. Hundreds of flames reflected endlessly in tall gilded mirrors, the air thick with perfume, laughter, and the low hum of 100 private conversations. Eleanor had never seen anything like it, the swirl of silk gowns in every color, the glitter of jewels at every throat, the orchestra playing somewhere beyond the crowd, its music barely audible over the noise of London's finest families gathered beneath one roof. She gripped Julian's arm a little tighter than necessary, grateful for his solid presence beside her, as dozens of curious eyes turned toward them the moment they crossed the threshold. "You look as though you are walking into battle," Julian murmured, leaning close enough that only she could hear him. "I feel as though I am," Eleanor admitted. "I have faced hungry livestock and furious debt collectors with less dread than I feel walking into this room, Your Grace." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips, quickly hidden as they moved deeper into the crowd, greeted by a stream of curious guests eager to catch a glimpse of the mysterious country girl who had somehow captured the attention of London's most notoriously unattainable duke. Eleanor navigated the introductions as best she could, offering polite smiles and careful answers, aware every moment of the whispers trailing behind them, the sideways glances weighing her worth against gowns far finer than the one she wore, and titles far grander than her own family's modest name. Lady Camden appeared within the hour, resplendent in gold silk that caught the candlelight with every movement, her smile bright and welcoming as she approached, though Eleanor recognized the calculation hidden beneath it immediately. "Your Grace," Lady Camden said warmly, curtsying to Julian before turning her attention to Eleanor with far less warmth. "Miss Whitfield, How lovely that you could join us. I hope the excitement of London society has not proven too overwhelming. Not at all, Lady Camden, Eleanor replied evenly. I find I manage difficult company rather well, given enough practice. Something flickered across Lady Camden's expression, quickly smoothed away, before she turned her attention fully to Julian, her voice dropping into something softer, more intimate. Julian, I do hope you will save a dance for me tonight. It has been far too long since we last spoke properly. I am afraid my evening is rather full, Camilla, Julian said, his tone polite but distant, though Eleanor did not miss the way his hand tightened slightly around her own, where it rested on his arm. Lady Camden's smile did not waver, though her eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. Of course, another time perhaps. She glanced once more at Eleanor, before drifting back into the crowd, and Eleanor felt certain, with an uneasy prickle at the back of her neck, that the encounter had been far from over. The evening unfolded with a strange mixture of tension and unexpected pleasure. Julian, to Eleanor's surprise, remained close by her side for much of the night, introducing her to acquaintances he seemed to genuinely respect, steering her away from the more venomous corners of the room, where gossip flowed as freely as champagne. When the orchestra struck up a waltz, he extended his hand without hesitation, and Eleanor, despite her nerves, found herself drawn into the dance with a confidence she had not known she possessed, guided by his steady lead across the polished floor. You dance beautifully, Julian said quietly as they moved together, for someone who claims to have spent her life mending fences rather than practicing quadrilles. I had an excellent teacher, Eleanor admitted, my mother, before she passed. She always said a woman should know how to move gracefully through difficulty, whether on a dance floor or in life. A wise woman, Julian said, and for a moment, spinning beneath the golden light of 100 candles, Eleanor allowed herself to forget the whispers, the calculating eyes, the weight of everything Lady Camden had said to her days before. For a moment, she simply existed in the warmth of Julian's steady gaze, in the quiet understanding that had grown between them since that first tense meeting in his grandmother's drawing room. The moment did not last. As the dance ended and Julian escorted her toward the refreshment table, Lady Camden intercepted them once more, this time with several other guests trailing curiously behind her, drawn by the promise of drama unfolding in real time. Miss Whitfield, Lady Camden said, her voice carrying just far enough to attract attention from nearby guests. I must say, it is remarkable how quickly you have adapted to society, given your circumstances. Tell me, have you resolved the matter of your father's debts, or does the Dowager Duchess continue covering them on your behalf? The surrounding conversation faltered, several heads turning toward them with open curiosity. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but she forced herself to remain calm, aware of Julian tensing beside her, his jaw tightening with barely restrained anger. That is a private matter, Lady Camden, Eleanor said evenly, and hardly appropriate conversation for a ballroom. Forgive me, Lady Camden said, though her tone made clear she felt nothing of the sort. I simply thought His Grace's guests deserved to understand the full circumstances of the woman he has chosen to elevate so publicly. It seems only fair, does it not, given how carefully the rest of us have been scrutinized these past years? Camilla, Julian said, his voice low and dangerous, you will stop this now. Will I? Lady Camden's composure cracked slightly, 2 years of carefully suppressed resentment finally spilling into the open. I have waited patiently for 2 years, Julian, while you rejected every suitable woman brought before you, and now you parade a penniless country girl through London society, as though she were somehow more deserving than the rest of us, simply because she does not flatter you, the way we were taught to flatter men like you. Tell me, Miss Whitfield, what exactly do you bring to this family beyond debts and desperation? The room had fallen nearly silent now, dozens of eyes fixed on the unfolding confrontation, and Eleanor felt the full weight of every gaze pressing against her, the humiliation of having her family's troubles laid bare before London's most influential families. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her, the old familiar urge to retreat, to apologize, to disappear back into the quiet obscurity of Hampshire where no one cared enough to judge her so cruelly. But then she felt Julian's hand tighten around her own, steady and certain, and something in her resolve hardened instead. I bring honesty, Lady Camden, Eleanor said, her voice clear enough to carry across the suddenly hushed ballroom. Something I suspect this room has seen very little of. Yes, my father left debts behind him. Yes, I have spent 2 years managing an estate on the brink of ruin with my own 2 hands, because pride does not put food on the table, and neither does pretending problems away with silk gowns and polite smiles. I did not come to London seeking a title, Lady Camden. I did not scheme or manipulate my way into this family's good graces. I was brought here, reluctantly, and I have tried, every day since, to be nothing but truthful with everyone I have met, including the Duke, who deserved better than another season of women pursuing his fortune rather than his character. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Eleanor could not tell whether it carried approval or scandal, but she pressed forward regardless, years of swallowed frustration finally finding release. You call my circumstances desperation, Eleanor continued. Perhaps they are, but I would rather stand here honestly desperate than spend 2 years chasing a man who has never once looked at me the way he looks at people he actually respects. Silence followed her words, thick and heavy, until Julian stepped forward, releasing Eleanor's hand, only to place his own firmly at the small of her back, a gesture of open, undeniable support that sent a fresh wave of whispers through the watching crowd. Lady Camden, Julian said, his voice carrying the full weight of authority he rarely displayed so openly. I have tolerated your pursuit these past 2 years, out of respect for old friendships and nothing more. That tolerance ends tonight. Miss Whitfield has shown more honesty, courage, and genuine character in the weeks I have known her than you have shown in the years I have known you. If you cannot extend her the basic courtesy owed to any guest in this house, I would ask that you refrain from addressing her, or myself, further this evening. Lady Camden's face drained of color, humiliation replacing her earlier confidence, as the surrounding guests began whispering in earnest now, the scandal she had hoped to create having turned entirely against her instead. She opened her mouth as though to respond, then closed it again, turning sharply on her heel and disappearing into the crowd without another word. Julian turned to Eleanor, his expression softer now than she had ever seen it, the cold reserve that had defined him since their first meeting entirely absent. Are you well? He asked quietly, guiding her toward a quieter corner of the room, away from the curious stares still lingering around them. I do not know, Eleanor admitted, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline of the confrontation had begun to fade. I have never spoken so openly in front of strangers before. You spoke the truth, Julian said, something this room sees far too rarely, myself included, until you arrived and refused to let me hide behind it any longer. Eleanor looked up at him, searching his face for the guarded coldness she had grown accustomed to, and finding instead something entirely different, something warm and unguarded and unmistakably sincere. Your Grace, Julian, he corrected softly. Please, after tonight I think we are well past formalities, Eleanor. Before she could respond, he reached up, gently brushing a stray curl from her face, his fingers lingering a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed. I have spent 3 seasons believing no woman could ever want me for anything beyond my title, he said quietly. Tonight, in front of half of London, you made it abundantly clear that you want nothing to do with my title at all. I find myself, for the first time in a very long while, wanting to be known simply as myself, if you would allow it. Eleanor's heart pounded, the noise of the ballroom fading into distant background as she looked up at him, the weeks of guarded tension between them finally giving way to something clearer, something neither of them could deny any longer. I think, she said softly, I would like that very much, Julian. Around them, the ball continued, the orchestra playing, the guests dancing and gossiping as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. But for Eleanor and Julian, standing together in a quiet corner of Lady Camden's grand ballroom, everything had changed. The careful walls both of them had built finally beginning, at last, to fall away. The days following the ball passed in a strange, unfamiliar quiet, the storm of gossip that had followed Lady Camden's public humiliation gradually settling into something closer to grudging admiration for the country girl who had spoken so plainly in front of London's most judgmental audience. Eleanor found herself the subject of curious visits and carefully worded invitations, families who had once dismissed her now eager to claim early acquaintance with the woman who had apparently captured the notoriously unattainable Duke of Ashworth's genuine affection. Eleanor cared little for the sudden shift in her social standing. What mattered far more was the change in Julian himself, the walls he had maintained so carefully since she first arrived, now falling away with each passing day, revealing a man far warmer, far more thoughtful, than the cold, dismissive figure who had once told her plainly that she was an inconvenience. He sought her out each morning now, no longer requiring his grandmother's manipulation to arrange their time together. They walked the gardens daily, no longer discussing roses forced into rigid rows, but instead speaking openly of their pasts, their fears, the burdens each had carried alone for far too long. Julian told her, in halting, careful words, of his mother's death when he was 12, of the cold distance that had grown between himself and his father in the years that followed, of the crushing weight of inheriting a title and an estate, teetering on the edge of ruin, before he had even finished mourning. "I built walls after she died," he admitted one afternoon, as they sat together on the same stone bench where he had first questioned her strange philosophy about wild roses. "I told myself it was practical, that a duke could not afford sentiment, that every woman who smiled at me wanted something I was not willing to give freely. I did not realize until you arrived how lonely those walls had made me. I know something of loneliness myself," Eleanor said quietly, "managing an estate alone, watching neighbors circle like vultures after my father's death, learning that most kindness comes with hidden conditions attached. I built walls of my own, Julian, though mine were built from calluses and exhaustion rather than titles and expectations. Perhaps that is why we understand each other," Julian said, reaching for her hand, when no one else in either of our worlds ever quite managed to. It was during one such quiet afternoon, weeks after the ball, that the Dowager Duchess finally revealed to Julian the truth she had shared with Eleanor weeks before, the story of his mother's own humble origins, the debt of friendship the Dowager had carried for 30 years, and the reasons she had chosen Eleanor above every wealthy, titled young woman paraded before her grandson. Julian listened in silence, his expression unreadable, until his grandmother finished speaking. "You knew this from the beginning," he said finally, turning to Eleanor with something between wonder and disbelief. "You knew my mother's story, and you said nothing. Your grandmother asked me to let her tell you herself, when she believed the time was right," Eleanor said. "I did not think it my place to share a story that was never mine to tell." Julian was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of everything he had just learned, the realization that his grandmother's seemingly impulsive scheme had, in fact, been rooted in a promise decades old, a debt of kindness finally being repaid through the two of them. "My mother would have liked you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "I believe that more than anything else my grandmother has told me today." That evening, after the Dowager had retired for the night, Julian found Eleanor alone in the library once more, the same room where he had first told her that he did not see her the way he had seen the others. He carried with him the small silver locket the Dowager had shown Eleanor weeks before, the one that had belonged to his mother. "My grandmother gave me this today," he said, opening his palm to reveal the locket resting there. "She said it should belong to whoever I choose to marry, when the time comes. I find, Eleanor, that I no longer wish to wait for some distant, uncertain time to make that choice." Eleanor's breath caught, her heart pounding as Julian knelt before her, the guarded, cold duke she had first met in his grandmother's drawing room now entirely absent, replaced by a man laid bare, vulnerable and sincere in a way she suspected very few people had ever witnessed. "I do not offer you a title, Eleanor, though you will certainly gain one," Julian said quietly. "I offer you myself, exactly as I am, flaws and walls and all the difficult years that shaped me into someone who nearly missed the chance to love you, because I was too afraid to trust anyone again. Will you marry me? Not because my grandmother wills it, not because society expects it, but because I have never wanted anything as much as I want to spend the rest of my life earning the honesty you have given me so freely since the moment we met." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes as she reached for his hands, pulling him gently to his feet. "I came to London believing I was nothing more than an inconvenience delivered to your door," she said softly. "I did not expect to find a man who saw past every wall I built to protect myself, who valued honesty over flattery, and who taught me that love does not require abandoning who I am to be worthy of it. Yes, Julian, I will marry you." He kissed her then, gently at first, then with growing certainty, the culmination of weeks of careful, guarded affection finally allowed to bloom fully into something neither of them intended to hide any longer. Their wedding took place 2 months later, not in the grand cathedral favored by London's most fashionable families, but in the small country chapel near Eleanor's family estate in Hampshire, surrounded by tenant farmers and neighbors who had known her since childhood, alongside the small circle of Ashworth family and friends, who had come to genuinely respect the quiet country girl, who had transformed their notoriously cold duke into a man capable of open, unguarded happiness. Eleanor wore a simple gown, far plainer than the elaborate silk creations favored by London society, though the Dowager had insisted on lending her the silver locket that had once belonged to Julian's mother, a fitting connection between the woman who had shaped Julian's early character and the woman who would now shape the rest of his life. Julian stood at the altar, watching Eleanor walk toward him down the narrow aisle of the small country chapel, his expression open and unguarded in a way that would have shocked anyone who had known him during those 3 cold, difficult seasons before her arrival. "You look happy," the Dowager whispered to her grandson as Eleanor drew near, unable to resist one final observation before the ceremony began. "I am happy, grandmother," Julian replied quietly, never taking his eyes from Eleanor's approaching figure. "For the first time since my mother died, I believe I finally understand what that word truly means." The ceremony was brief and simple, exactly as Eleanor had wished, free from the elaborate spectacle that so often accompanied noble weddings in London. When Julian finally kissed his bride before the small gathered crowd, the cheer that rose from the tenant farmers and neighbors who had known Eleanor her entire life carried a warmth no grand London ballroom could ever hope to match. As they emerged from the chapel into the bright afternoon sunlight, Eleanor caught sight of her family's small, weathered estate house in the distance, the same modest home she had left weeks earlier, believing herself nothing more than an inconvenient pawn in a duchess's scheme. She thought of Lady Camden's cruel words at the ball, of every doubt that had threatened to overwhelm her since arriving in London, and found, standing now as Duchess of Ashworth beside a man who loved her not for her title or fortune but for exactly who she was, that every difficult step of her journey had led precisely where it was always meant to. "Second thoughts, Duchess?" Julian asked softly, noticing her thoughtful expression as they walked together toward the waiting carriage. "None at all," Eleanor said, smiling up at him with the same honest, unguarded warmth that had first captured his attention weeks before. "I was simply thinking how strange it is that the quietest country girl in Hampshire ended up teaching London's coldest duke how to love." Julian laughed then, a full, genuine sound Eleanor had rarely heard from him before their courtship began, and pulled her close as they climbed into the carriage that would carry them toward the beginning of their new life together, leaving behind forever the cold, guarded strangers they had once been, and embracing instead the honest, unguarded happiness neither of them had believed themselves capable of finding. 6 months into their marriage, Ashworth House had transformed into something Eleanor barely recognized from the cold, formal residence she had first entered as a reluctant guest. The rigid rows of roses in the garden had been left to grow slightly wilder at her request, their blooms spilling over neatly trimmed borders in a way that would have horrified the old head gardener but delighted Eleanor every time she passed the window of the small sitting room she had claimed as her own. The staff, once stiff and formal in the presence of their notoriously distant duke, now moved through the house with an ease and warmth that Mrs. Pemberton attributed entirely to the new Duchess's influence. Eleanor had not abandoned the practical habits of her upbringing simply because she now wore silk instead of homespun wool. She spent her mornings reviewing the estate ledgers alongside Julian, offering suggestions drawn from years of managing her own family's precarious finances, suggestions that Julian, to the surprise of the entire household, actually implemented rather than dismissing. Tenant families who had once approached the estate office with quiet dread now found themselves welcomed by a duchess who understood, better than most noble women ever could, the exhausting weight of watching a harvest fail or a debt come due. "You have made him better," the dowager observed one afternoon, watching from the drawing-room window as Julian walked the garden paths with Eleanor, deep in conversation about a new irrigation system for the estate's eastern fields. "Not merely happier, though that alone would have been enough. You have made him a better duke." "He was already becoming that before I arrived," Eleanor said, though she could not help the warmth that spread through her chest at the dowager's words. "I have simply given him someone to share the burden with, rather than carrying it entirely alone." "That," the dowager said, "is precisely what your grandmother once gave to my late husband, when he needed it most. It seems some debts, once repaid, continue paying dividends for generations." Lady Camden, humiliated beyond recovery by the public confrontation at her own ball, had quietly withdrawn from London society for the better part of the season, eventually accepting an invitation to stay with distant relatives in Bath, where the gossip surrounding her failed pursuit of the Duke could not follow quite so relentlessly. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in the woman's downfall, only a quiet relief that the constant undercurrent of tension that had shadowed her early weeks in London had finally faded into distant memory. Her own family's estate in Hampshire, freed from the crushing weight of debt through the dowager's intervention, had begun to flourish under new management, a capable steward hired with Julian's guidance, allowing Eleanor's aunt to finally rest after years of anxious struggle. Eleanor visited often, sometimes accompanied by Julian, who had grown genuinely fond of the modest countryside that had shaped his wife into the woman he had come to love so completely, and sometimes alone, savoring quiet afternoons among the wild, unruly gardens of her childhood home. It was during one such visit, seated beside her aunt in the familiar warmth of the Hampshire kitchen, that Eleanor first shared the news that would soon change Ashworth House once more, the quiet confirmation that she was expecting their first child. Julian's reaction, when she told him later that evening, surprised even Eleanor with its raw, unguarded emotion. The formidable Duke of Ashworth reduced to tears of genuine joy at the prospect of a family he had once believed himself too broken, too guarded, to ever properly build. "I spent so many years believing love was a weakness reserved for people who could afford the risk of losing it," Julian admitted, holding Eleanor close that evening in the quiet privacy of their bedchamber. "I did not understand, until you, that refusing love entirely was its own kind of loss, one far more permanent than any grief I feared." "You are not broken, Julian," Eleanor said softly, resting her head against his chest. "You are simply waiting for someone patient enough to prove that walls, however carefully built, are never as strong as the people determined enough to see past them." The Dowager Duchess, upon learning of the coming addition to the family, wept openly for the first time in Eleanor's memory, clutching the small silver locket that had once belonged to Julian's mother, now worn daily around Eleanor's own neck. She would be so proud, the Dowager whispered, more to herself than to either of them, to see her son finally happy, finally whole, and finally ready to become the father she always believed he could be. As autumn settled over the Ashworth estate, the gardens Eleanor had encouraged to grow slightly wilder, now blazing with the deep reds and golds of the changing season, Eleanor often found herself standing at the same window where the Dowager had first watched her walk the grounds with Julian months before, marveling at how completely her life had transformed since that frightened, reluctant carriage ride into London. She thought sometimes of the plain, exhausted country girl who had arrived expecting nothing more than a brief, awkward introduction, before returning to a life of quiet struggle in Hampshire. She thought of the cold, guarded Duke who had told her plainly, within minutes of their meeting, that she was an inconvenience he had no intention of tolerating, and she marveled, every single day, at how completely two broken, guarded people had managed to heal each other simply by refusing to lie about who they truly were. Julian found her there one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold above the wild, blooming gardens below, and wrapped his arms gently around her from behind, resting his hand protectively over the gentle curve of her growing belly. "Any regrets, Duchess?" he asked softly, echoing the same question he had asked on their wedding day, though his voice now carried none of the uncertainty it once had. "Only one," Eleanor said, smiling as she leaned back against him, watching the last light of day fade slowly over the estate that had become, against every expectation, truly her home. That it took a stubborn old duchess and a determined country girl this long to teach the coldest duke in London that love was never a weakness at all, but simply the truth he had been too afraid to trust. Julian laughed, the warm, genuine sound that had become so familiar these past months, and pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head as they stood together, watching the sun set slowly over the gardens, the estate, and the family they had built together from nothing more than honesty, patience, and a debt of kindness, 30 years in the making, finally, completely repaid.